Welcome to this, the 16th in our series of special webinars about the challenges North Carolina is facing as we react to COVID-19. This week marks the final week in our Jumpstart series, sponsored by Tony Brown, a 1983 NC State grad in honor of legendary NC State basketball coach K-Yow. Thank you, Tony, for sponsoring all of this month. I'm Leslie Boney from the North Carolina State Institute for Emerging Issues, and since March, we've been on every week looking at a different issue emerging during the pandemic, talking with state and community leaders who are helping us to figure out our way forward. For the past 3 weeks, we've been looking at the question of how we find our way back carefully as we try to inch towards some regaining semblance of normality. How do we jumpstart some of our most important industries and institutions rationally and safely? So far in this part of the series, we've looked at the road back for one of our state's most important and summer-dependent industries, tourism. We've looked at the challenges that cities and towns and county governments are having as they try to plan for next year without knowing exactly how much money they have to provide services. Last week, we looked at the challenges families across the state are facing as they try to get online. And this week, the final week in our series, we look back at one of the most complicated and important decisions we're going to need to make as we find our way back. What's it going to look like as we try to jumpstart our public schools? We know you have a lot of questions and comments. We ask you to be active in getting those up. If possible, share them with everyone. If not, please feel free to just share them with our panelists, but we're going to try to get to as many of those as possible during this hour. We know how important this issue is for so many of you. Today, we want to look at it, this topic from a national viewpoint, from the viewpoint of a couple of superintendents in the state that are on the line to really make some of these tough decisions, and from a parent's viewpoint. We've asked Evan Lefsky, the Director of Education Consulting for the Public Consulting Group, to talk about what he's seeing across the country. We've asked two superintendents, Dr. Lynn Moody, the Superintendent of Rowan-Salisbury Schools, and Steve Ellis, Dr. Steve Ellis, the Superintendent of Nash-Rocky Mount Schools, to be with us. And then we want to talk with the parent. We've asked Amy Jones with the Wake PTA Council to join us. And welcome to you all. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Evan, let me turn to you first. You look at and think about school systems all across the country. What kind of buckets are you seeing as people are trying to sort through this challenge of whether people are going to go back in August or September? How would you categorize the different perspectives that schools across the country are taking on this?
Yeah, thanks, Leslie. Since the pandemic began, folks have been wrestling with the idea of virtual instruction. Most school districts moved to some sort of virtual instruction over the last number of months through the end of the school year. The majority of school districts, state education agencies, governor's offices, and local agencies that we partner with have been especially hyper-focused on the issues of equitable access to broadband and student devices to support the virtual instruction, especially with the unknown factor of how long this will last, and even the potential that even if we come back full-time in person, there may be a point at which we'd have to shift back to virtual instruction. And these are two very real issues. However, solving for these won't guarantee equitable access to high-quality virtual instruction or outcomes for all children. I just was reading a recent survey of school superintendents, found that 94% had at this point not opened or not announced when they would reopen. More than half said they would open on time. A third said they were looking at schedule changes to school opening, and 13% expected to be delayed. And I think the key is whenever schools choose to reopen, and whether that is fully in person, fully virtual, or blended, what will be needed is really a comprehensive approach that includes supports for students, for teachers, for leaders and families, and especially starting to think about differentiated supports, especially for young children and families who have different needs. These supports are really going to require K-12 school districts to work in partnership with other local agencies to ensure that there's, adequate supports that lead to student success. A few of these kind of buckets of support that we're seeing superintendents and local leaders talk about are really in the form of professional learning for teachers and leaders to facilitate this transition to virtual or blended instruction, high quality digital curriculum and instructional materials, and then really critical that there are specific supports in place for students who may struggle with virtual instruction, including students with disabilities and students learning English.
Let me lay out where North Carolina is, because North Carolina is in a particular situation right now, and really just want to take a look at the options that have been presented. And included in those is an all virtual, all remote possibility. These are guidelines that have come out from two different sources. First from the State Department of Health and Human Services on June 8th, and then June 11th, a joint communication from the Department of Public Instruction and State Board of Education that laid out three options. And these are options that are described as a roadmap, one that they hope will make decisions less difficult, that allow for local flexibility, but they've also been described as not a finish line, but a new beginning line. So Plan A is basically fully open with minimal social distancing. That's a scenario that is described as something that would happen if metrics either stabilize or improve. All students would be returning. There would be minimal social distancing. Plan B includes moderate social distancing. That's assuming metrics worsen and imagines sort of a 50% scenario with 6 feet of social distancing. Plan C is remote learning only, and that assumes that metrics worsen significantly and that no students return. So that's the overview of the three options that North Carolina has. The governor was going to announce a decision yesterday, and that decision has been delayed. Meanwhile, yesterday, North Carolina set a new single-day record for new cases, and the nation as a whole also set a new single-day record. So let me turn to our superintendents now and just ask you, in the broadest way, this is a really uncertain time for you with so many different calculations that you're trying to make. Dr. Moody, how are you sorting through this?
It is a very difficult and very challenging time. I've described it to many as between the three plans, we need to have three plans that we've never operated before for our summer planning, and which is 3 times more work than we are normally experiencing during the summer to get ready for the opening of school in areas where we don't know what the work really entails completely. But some of those things overlap, and our teams are working hard, and we've had great conversations about how it looks. I think what we've really appreciated is how much we value education and how badly we all want to get back to school and see our students and reconnect.
Dr. Ellis, I'm guessing similar thoughts for you, both a commitment to safety, but also a commitment to trying to get back to school. How are you balancing this time?
I think the toughest part is you are trying to fly this plane with 3 different models that you're really not used to. Lynn's right, it is so different than what we're accustomed to. I am lucky in Nash that I have a good team. I have only been a superintendent for about 3 or 4 months now, so this is definitely learned by fire. But it is to think of the safety of the kid first. That's what you just put at the front of this, because and then you try to figure out, is this doable? And I know Lynn's probably like me. You're looking at this through a different set of lens now, and the metrics are playing the role here. But I think we're going to be able to develop these 3 plans, and we're just waiting because we know our job is to educate students, and it's tough right now because we know kids you've got fragile kids out there right now. We need to get out there and reach. So we've got to figure out this plan.
want to come back to both of you in a little bit, but let me bring in a parent who's been thinking a lot about this also. Amy Jones, welcome, and thank you for being with us. You're in a position of leadership with the Wake PTA Council, but just wanted to make clear for purposes of this conversation, you're not speaking on behalf of the Wake PTA Council, but rather as a parent. So thank you for being with us. You've got 2 school-age children, and you're trying to figure out how to plan as a parent for the fall.
Definitely. Yeah. Thank you. Just to be clear, that Wake PTA Council in North Carolina PTA hasn't taken any kind of official stance on the reopening of schools. So as a parent, I've got a rising 11th grader and a rising 7th grader. And it's challenging because they want to know what's going to happen. Kids need a certain amount of predictability to feel safe and comfortable. So we're kind of scrambling for all options and letting them know day to day, it's going to be fine. We're going to figure it out, but it's going to look really different than you were expecting. And I think that's kind of what we're hearing across the board from a lot of parents is that they just are anxious to know so that they can make some plans. Parents who are working that are trying desperately to figure out what childcare is going to be, especially if we go back to a blended model. And so the kids are in the classroom part of the time and out of the classroom part of the time. So there's a lot of decisions to be made. It's been a bit of a wait and see game this summer, which is understandable because the task for figuring this out is huge. It's monumental.
Let me just show a little bit of data on this, and we'll be showing data throughout this, and mostly it's going to accumulate to the point where I come back to our superintendents and say, how do you deal with all this uncertainty? But from a parent standpoint, let me just show 3 different polls that have been taken. The first one is the Elon poll that asked people to react to things that were described in very similar ways to option A, B, and C. So just for simplicity's sake, I'm going to describe these as option A, B, and C. So the full sort of back to normal school approach, 34% of people surveyed, and this is not just parents, this is all people surveyed, 34% said they liked that approach. The blended approach, 38%, full-time remote, 29%. So no real clarity there if you're looking for an overwhelming consensus. That's a poll done last week. Then there was a Wake County parent survey, which I'm showing because that's where Amy's from, showed that 43% of parents would be comfortable going back this fall. That's kind of a mixture of an A and B question, so it wasn't asked exactly that way. It drops to 35% if it's going to be fully in the school building. 22% there said they would prefer fully online. And finally, I wanted to show a national survey that was done by the American Enterprise Institute that found that 27% of parents were comfortable with sending kids back to school as normal in either August or September. The reason I wanted to include this one is that there's a breakdown racially, and hadn't seen that in a lot of the other polls, that shows a fairly distinctive break there. 34% of whites surveyed said they were comfortable. 19% of people of color said they were comfortable with students going back to school. And I would just note that in North Carolina, 70% of the cases are among people of color. So 46% of the cases are in the Latinx community and 24% in the African American community. It could be that some of the reaction, some of the breakdown racially has to do with the prevalence of cases that you're seeing. So, Amy, with all that on the table, let me just ask you to react to any part of it that you would like to, and
Sure.
tell me what you're hearing from parents about their ambivalence or their confusion about what to do.
Well, I think that those statistics really reflect what we have heard as parents anecdotally, which is it's across the board. It is very evenly split from people who are thinking, I've got to get my kids back in school. They need to be back with their teachers. They need face-to-face instruction to thrive. I need to go back to work. All the way to the other end of the spectrum, which is I don't want my child setting foot in a public building until everyone in the country has been vaccinated. And all of those viewpoints are valid. So there's no one size fits all answer that's going to work for everyone. I think that what I have heard is that we are working towards, for lack of a better word, the least bad situation. And so I think that it is one thing that I have heard overall from parents resoundingly is their appreciation and awe of public school teachers after they have spent many months trying to supervise remote learning at home. I am a former public school teacher, so I don't know if that's a blessing or a curse for my kids. So, yeah, that's definitely it. And also, I have encouragingly heard concern for the larger community. I hear a lot of parents speaking of, if I'm having such a difficult time doing this, then I can't imagine what this is like for more challenged populations. Parents who are don't have a higher level of education, parents who can't access English as their first language, and parents who are having a difficult time accessing resources. I think we've also heard a really big variety between where you are. Because there are certain parts of the state that COVID has not hit as hard as others, and so they're thinking, maybe this isn't such a big deal. I mean, I haven't heard a lot about this out in the community, so I think it'd be fine for them to go back to school. Whereas where I am in Raleigh, it's more urban area. We've got, I think we're up to 191 or 192 schools in our school system. So, it just, to sum it up, as the statistics show, it's really all over the place, really all over the map.
Yeah, I saw a statistic yesterday, 40% of adults 20 to 44, working adults age 20 to 54 have a child in school. And so as workplaces reopen, a lot of people view school on some level as childcare. It's obviously much more than that.
Of course, yeah.
If they're being asked to come back physically to work at the same time that their child is at home, then they've got a built-in conflict that they're going to have to wrestle with.
Definitely. Yeah. And I think that, they're probably feeling, if they have gone back to work, feeling some pressure from their supervisors or bosses to know what they're going to need to do. So, the whole Plan B scenario obviously is the one that is going to cause a lot of logistical challenges if you are looking at an A-B situation, alternating days or alternating weeks, and then how do you make sure you've got siblings on those same schedules? And it's a lot to try and figure out.
Yeah, one of our questions coming in is what about childcare, early education service? One poll showed that maybe 40% of daycares could be closing as a result of this. So that creates an added challenge.
I do know in Wake County that they are all definitely talking with outside agencies such as YMCA and Boys and Girls Club and other partner agencies to look at what they can arrange to assist in childcare situations if we do go to a blended Plan B model.
Thank you, Amy. We'll come back to you in a little bit. I wanted to add just a little bit of information. First of all, here's how you can get in touch with Amy. And I wanted to add a little bit of information about employees. So we've heard a little bit about how parents are thinking about this. Another question is how are school system employees thinking about this? So Dr. Moody, I'm going to turn to you to respond to this, but let me just real quickly show a couple of these slides. Gives a sense of some of the data. This is a Wake County employee survey. I'm guessing you have your own. That shows that roughly 2/3 of people are uncomfortable with Plan A. If there's some built-in additional social distancing, that gets down to 58%. That flips with Plan B to roughly 2/3 of people being comfortable with that. You get up to 72% with Plan C, and presumably some of those people are uncomfortable because they don't think the learning will be as good. So that's one set of data. And then a mixture of sort of North Carolina and national data that I think is important just in playing out the range of opinion on this. There's a group of 25% of our population that believes that all restrictions of any sort should be lifted in schools, businesses, and restaurants. That's a poll from last week in North Carolina. Then these national polling by Ed Week in late May showed that 65% of educators thought schools should remain closed. 12% of teachers were thinking about leaving the profession early because they were nervous about the pandemic. And 36% of teachers, principals, and school district leaders said they had a health condition placing them at higher risk, which means presumably they'd be nervous about going back into school. So turning to you, Dr. Moody, now all this evidence is sort of out here. You've got employees that you've got to think about. You've got teachers, you've got parents, you've got students. There are racial group differences. There are political differences. Governor Cooper says, let's wait. Lieutenant Governor Forrest, who's running against him this fall, says, let's open immediately. There's a difference in political parties. The Elon poll found that 46% of Republicans were in favor of something that sounded like option A, 23% of Democrats. So employees, teachers, parents, students, race, politics, all on your plate. So can you talk about how you're sorting through that? What does that look like?
I think you have nailed the challenge. As we look at it, there's no clear answer to what's the right way to do education this fall. It depends on who you ask. And in some of the polls, unfortunately, what I'm concerned about is we're not really asking everyone. So we did a poll, and EdNC helped us do a poll early on. Our numbers from our parents are very similar to the national average and the numbers that you showed on the screen. They're split about a third, and what they would like as a learning preference for their children. But when we polled our employees to see which learning teaching style they would prefer to teach in next year, it was 50-50. So half of our teachers were saying, I'd be interested in teaching remotely again in the fall, which surprised us, quite honestly. And half of our teachers were saying, no, I definitely want to get back into school. The groups that I'm concerned about for us are school bus drivers. About 80% of our school bus drivers are over the age of 65. Many people who drive buses do it part-time, and it's kind of a little retirement gig, and they're wonderful at it. And so we're obviously concerned about that, how that will look, and we're not really sure who will show up for work and who won't show up in the fall, no matter what plan is called. And also with the polls, what we recognize is the people who respond to those polls, like when we polled our parents, we got 9,000 of our 20,000 parents. It's a pretty significant number. I worry about the 9,000 we did not hear from, because those parents typically aren't as connected and may not have the resources to weigh in what they're thinking. So we're very concerned about there's a lot of people in our school district that we've always felt a special privilege and burden for, who don't advocate one way or the other and expect us to figure it out because they trust that we're educators. And so, we try to pay attention to that as well. So it's all, as I said, there's no real clear answers. What we are working to do is to try to figure out how to give everybody the best we can their own learning preference or their own teaching preference. Is that possible? So if you do not want to send your child to school and the governor calls plan A in the fall and you don't feel comfortable with sending your child to school, I have a student chat, and I have a really gifted young man in my student chat, and he said, when we immigrated to America, we came to New York. So we have a lot of family members in New York that this has hit very hard. I have asthma. I had a treatment this morning before this chat, and my mom is not going to let me come to school this fall no matter what. So we're trying to plan for all of those plans, in addition to the three, how we can have 3 different learning options and teaching options for all 3 of those plans. So maybe it's 9 times more work, but we think that that's worth it to give our parents and students preferences.
So one of the questions in the chat from one of our community college leaders is whether there could be something like what she called a high flex option, where there are some people who are in those unique situations and they're learning differently from other people who want to be there physically. How would something like that work?
Well, and that's what we're working on. We're opening a brand new K-8 virtual school. Our high schools have had virtual options for several years. Our school district went 1-to-1 6 years ago. So we're in our second rollover with technology. So I know that people are at different places in the state, but we felt pretty blessed about where we were at. We felt like that was an equity issue from the very beginning, that people didn't have access to the same kind of information and technology. So we bridged that gap, and we feel like our teachers have had a lot of professional development along those lines. We've had e-learning days where all of our children have been home e-learning during the school calendar year. We did all of our makeup days, but it's different when you go remote every single day. It's completely different how you do instruction in that environment, which was a huge learning curve for us, even though we had the technology, knew how to use the technology, and had planned these days before. So that type of model going forward, I think, is going to require a lot of a different kind of professional development. We know how to do it at the college level. We know how to do it at the high school level. Thinking about guided reading in the first grade remotely is going to take a lot more work. We are just not there yet, but we're getting there. We're learning a lot.
I just wanted to, again, show the slide that we had up a little bit earlier, and just to say that you've broken the discussion groups into different areas, but all of these different working groups are looking at all three options. Has that been helpful to do that? And how have you been able to involve people? Is that solely people within the school system, or does that involve others as well?
These working groups pretty much are all of the administrators in our entire district. So every principal, every director, every cabinet level member is in one or more of these working groups, and we've divided them up so we could try to conquer. So there's a resource working group, and they're focused on any technology issues that we might still have, how we're going to deal with the human resources aligned to this. This one's going to be huge for us, because when we open this K-8 virtual school, if 23% of our parents who have expressed an interest actually do go, we have to realign all of our teacher allocations for every single school in our district. This is a huge amount of work and a very heavy lift. And then we have to realign all of our finances based on where the students are actually attending at the time. So that group has been focusing on all three models for that. Our operation group has obviously been focusing on transportation. We have opened athletics according to the guidelines right now. How we're going to serve students in school nutrition inside the classroom, so there's social distancing at school, but also how will we serve lunch to our students who are remote? Is that even a possibility? And then plexiglass in all of our buildings, and tape on the floor, and how we have one-way plans. And there's a huge amount of work for this contingency planning. And then the instructional working group is looking at how are we going to test our students to find out where they're at and how much learning loss we have. You mentioned earlier, Leslie, about remedial practices and how we will catch them up. And will face-to-face actually look different? And then we do know that how we support remote learning, we would like to change some of the work we're doing. Another group is wellness and safety, and this is how we take the temperature of a child when they come in the building, where that'll be located at, and all the work around physical health, wellness for employees, and then professional development to support that, and then this new virtual K-8 school. So everyone's on at least one of those, some two, and they're pretty much working, I feel like 24/7. They are working 8 to 10 hours a day in these groups, and have been for the last few weeks, to get ready for school to open.
Thank you for the work that you're doing. Dr. Ellis, you mentioned earlier that we have your contact information, Dr. Moody. And Dr. Ellis, you mentioned earlier that you arrived, and as soon as you arrived, the world blew up. I don't think there's a causal effect there, but you walked into an amazing situation. And one of the things Dr. Moody talked about was the pivot toward online learning. That was something that you had to figure out really quickly. And Dan DeMeo in our chat is reminding us that last week's program was on the issue that the Institute for Emerging Issues is calling digital inclusion. How do we get those that don't have access at home online? You figured that out pretty quickly. Can you talk about how you did that?
So we realized we were lucky to have an LMS system of Canvas for our secondary schools, but we realized that even being one-to-one, the district, 30% of our population still could not receive internet broadband. So we went back to learning packets and started trying to basically duplicate a teacher's connectivity, and if a kid needed a learning packet. That's my concern moving into this year, because we can't solve that issue. That's a tough one to solve when you don't have internet access. We've got a group of churches that are going to allow us to use some hotspots in the fall. We're trying to find places where kids can access that. It worked pretty good so far, but that was our issue. Still having a learning package, you would think that most people feel like everyone has internet. Well, that just doesn't happen. And I think that's going to be the challenge moving forward. We're going to provide a menu of options for parents. I mean, I think Lynn just described it perfect. We're going to have a menu of options for all these parents that they can choose. But then there's going to be that 20 or 30% that we have to figure out, that we got to speak for them. So that's my concern right now. We can develop all the plans. We have all these reopening task force, but there's still a percent of the population we've got to figure out how to reach, because that's my concern as a superintendent, because we've got to educate all. Students with disabilities, we've got to figure out how we get in touch with these kids. That was my biggest concern, because in your mind, that there's kids out there that haven't been in school since March. Mm-hmm. So we got to figure out that part. Now, how we do that, I don't know yet. We're going to keep the learning packets going. We're going to keep trying to get counselors to call these students, call these parents, because we're losing that, I call it that personal touch that we got in this business to be a part of. And that social emotional part now, kids aren't getting it. And when it comes to the political and all that, that's just noise you have to ignore. Because in the end, you got in this business to be with students, and that's how we're going to move forward in Nash.
Pick up on that. There was a recent study by McKinsey that looked at learning loss so far, and it gets at a lot of the issues that you talked about. So these are the risks of learning loss. McKinsey is estimating that so far, on average, school students have lost 3.1 months of learning. If we don't resume in person until January, they're estimating 6.8 months. I'm sure that varies widely depending on how well the online learning goes. But there's a separate study by the Harvard School of Public Health that looks at the potential increase in the education achievement gap, and particularly for Black, Hispanic, and low-income students. And that's something you were just speaking about. I think we could probably add in those who typically have had an IEP. There was a question about that. And it's good to hear your concern about that. Are there any reassurances you could give to parents about the importance and the seriousness with which you're taking that question?
I think that when you start the conversation of fragile students and what do we do during this time? When you build these plans, we've even talked about letting our exceptional children's population come to school. Go ahead and provide that social distancing. Try to get those students back in school to be served. Same as with these students who are at risk. We have the data on these students. If we can try to bring those kids back with a plan B, think about those kids first. There are a lot of parents, in my opinion, are going to choose the virtual option. They're probably going to feel safer that way, but there's going to be that group that we're going to need to probably bus, get them to school a few days a week, start the remediation process, because the gaps that we're creating, the longer we wait, these gaps are widening, and that is something it is going to be hard for those kids to recover. And what you don't want to do during this time is start that acceleration of these other students, and you have that gap just widening. And just if we could try our best to get those students back, and start some of those remediation, the guided practice, because I'm like, Lynn, I don't know how, when we put laptops in a kindergarten and second graders possession for them to learn how to do school, I don't know how successful we're going to be at that. And that concerns me because a parent, when they sign a kid up for kindergarten, I don't think they want to meet their teacher on Zoom. So that personal connection that we're losing right now concerns me. So there has to be a plan in place for some sort of those at-risk students that we can bring them back in and start some of that gap, just decreasing it a bit, just to find out where they're at. I tell my group all the time and senior staff, I want to know where they are now. And that's what's driving me crazy as a superintendent, because you can't plan unless you know where you're starting. And that's my concern right now for those students.
And Leslie, if I could just add to what Steve is saying, and saying in the beginning, when we started and we saw plan A, plan B, plan C, quite honestly, most of our folks said, oh, we hope it's plan A or plan C, but B, logistically, there's no way you can do it, and we don't want it. We have completely changed our mind about that. All of our teachers and educators now are saying, oh, whatever he calls, and we were very anxious about yesterday, don't let it be plan C. Like, give us plan B, we'll work it out. Logistically, yep, it'll be a nightmare, but we need to see our children. We have got to see them. If we can see them 1 day a week or 2 days a week, we can give them enough instruction and things, but there are kids that we physically need to see. And quite honestly, they're all of them. There's not a child that we don't believe it's in their best interest that they connect with their teacher face to face. And we know that there will be families who will choose to go completely remote, and we honor that. But for the most part, we believe that children really need, and our teachers want some time, even if we can't have a full week with them.
Right.
Evan, you started off talking about this same topic and the importance of being attentive to those who are being left behind or have the potential to be left behind. What are you seeing nationally that encourages you? What are the most innovative approaches you've seen about really helping to reach those that have the potential, if it's not a full-on traditional school situation, be served in a meaningful way so that those differences don't get greater?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely critical. One of the areas that we've been seeing nationally that's pretty exciting in school districts around the country is they're leveraging virtual tutoring to actually support students who may have already been at risk, or those students with disabilities who may typically respond better to those direct supports. So in the cases like Dr. Moody's saying, where we may not be in school every day of the week, and we know we have students that really require that extra support, we're seeing this virtual tutoring as a way to actually enact that IEP, keep making progress towards those goals with those students, even when we can't be face-to-face. We've seen out of Richmond, Virginia, they've implemented a pretty extensive virtual tutoring program specifically for students with disabilities. And the stories are great because now not only is it the student who's participating in the instruction, but in many cases we're seeing the parents being a part of that education process. And so students who may have been struggling in the traditional face-to-face are now flourishing with the virtual tutoring. We had a parent we talked to who, it was a father and son. The father does lawn care, and he had his son with him helping. And, they're sitting under a tree just doing their tutoring that day. And the fact that they can participate in that together was pretty exciting. I think the other thing, one of the remote challenges that we're seeing is that the idea of the data we need to really be responsive to students and responsive to their needs so we can really customize that instruction. That's much easier when students are sitting in front of us. The idea that we can make adjustments to the instructional program and the supports in that blended or virtual environment is really challenging. One of the exciting things that I've seen is actually the Department of Public Instruction, North Carolina, is taking a significant step this coming fall by providing an early warning system for all North Carolina districts to ensure students are actually staying on track for success, whether that's in a virtual or a face-to-face or some kind of blended setting, and then helping them to put success plans in place when students require additional supports. And obviously, this is going to be really critical for students who are already at risk of academic failure when we're not seeing them every single day.
Some endorsement coming in over the chat from Deborah Young talking about the importance of her children seeing their teachers, from Representative Craig Horn of Union County talking about the importance of figuring out a blended approach, even if it is not easy. And it sounds like it's not easy. Evan, maybe you could just ground us a little bit. What do you think the biggest issues are that we need to figure out, that schools need to figure out if we are meeting face-to-face in a traditional way? And it doesn't look like we're heading that way, but if we're really going to come back and we're going to be meeting face-to-face and it's going to be 100% attendance, what are the biggest issues that school systems need to be wrestling with there in that scenario?
Yeah, Leslie, and I think whether it's 100% or it's a few days a week, some of the same kinds of challenges exist. Obviously, social distancing in classrooms, lunchrooms. I was a high school administrator. Those lunchrooms and those hallways are packed. That's going to be a real challenge. And actually, I think Dr. Moody talked about may require some physical modifications to schools. Additionally, screening for illness will be a significant challenge that's going to vary really depending upon the infection rate in individual communities. And then, of course, it was mentioned earlier, there's specific challenges around transporting students to and from school. There's a number of blended models that are being proposed across the country to address some of these concerns. And obviously, each model has pros and cons. We're hearing about phased reopening, where smaller groups of students are brought back sooner, where this could be your students with disabilities, as an example, who may require more face-to-face supports. There's also track systems where, some students attend on some days and other students on other days. Staggered schedules, right, where you've got a morning group and an afternoon group. And actually, there's one strategy that the CDC is actually recommending, which is a bubble approach, what they're calling a bubble approach, where students actually remain with the same group the entire day, with the idea that this will limit the potential exposure if a student contracts COVID, right? And so, obviously there's challenges around that because it increases the classrooms necessary to ensure, social distancing. Each of these approaches are coming with specific challenges we mentioned for families, because now they have to manage the days and times when children are not in school. I mean, I have 2 teenagers. I'm not as worried about that if they have to be home and doing their work from home. But certainly nationally, we're seeing a trend in the majority of states that whatever model is chosen, whether it's in-person, virtual, or blended, it's really being left as a local control decision that's being made by superintendents, school boards, and obviously working with parents. And so those are some of the key things, that we're seeing for the if folks are going to come back at all in some type of in-person environment.
Ellis, question in the chat that be interested in your reaction to. That is, how do you coordinate with the business community if you're doing some sort of blended approach? How do you message that so that parents are able to go to work, but students are able to be at home sometimes as well? How do you wrestle with that?
That to me,
Yes.
the what we're hoping to do with one of these committees that we're creating is we want to be able to provide a map for all parents to go to with businesses that have the internet, churches, parking lots, where a kid who has a Chromebook who does not have access can just go to one of those sites. We started that in the fall, but when some of the cases started getting high, I think our some of the businesses were closing. There were some issues, concerns, but now we've contacted them again, and we're just trying to find sites where our kids can go through. Because our concern, to me, is transportation. So if a parent lives down the road from a Walmart parking lot or a local church, and the Wi-Fi is available for them to sit in that parking lot, that would help me, because the restrictions on transportation, to me, that's going to be the dicey one for us, because when you transport 40% of your kids, and you can only say 10 on a bus, that's going to be tough for us. So we thought that if we could get online, parents could access a whole list of sites where it could be down the road, a local church, a business. That would be a good first step for us. So if kids could not go to schools, that we would have another option.
Dr. Moody, another question that's similar, this one from Ann Bacon, are any communities working with their chambers and Smart Start partnerships to right-size employer expectations? I think you may be muted.
Sorry. I do think that across the state, we're all working closely with not only our parents, but our business community as well. One of the things that you mentioned that's come out of this is it's become very apparent that our economic well-being depends on the custodial function of schools. And while we've always known that and thought about it, and as educators, we believe that teaching and learning should take priority, not a custodial function. But you can see the conflict during a time like this. And I just want to be sure to say that all the challenges around this, all the disputes, everything that is difficult and the hard work, there is a lot of silver linings. And I hope in the process of this, our schools were not perfect, what we consider to be normal for all children. They did not serve all children well. And now we have this beautiful opportunity with different constraints to look at it and be more learner-centered, to make it fit all children for all different kinds of models. While standardized testing, and I shouldn't get started on that because we would have another hour show, is off the table, and some of the rules and regulations that have made us more government institutional-like schools instead of learner-centered are not haunting us as we plan for the fall. So let's use this. Like, what a wonderful time to be an educator, where you get to really create something uniquely special that really unleashes the potential of every child. And so there's a lot of silver linings.
Lynn, if I could echo off that from a parent perspective, this is something that I've tried to concentrate on with my kids and friends I've spoken with, and would really strongly encourage parents to do, is to look at what positives are coming out of this. What are you learning from having to go through this situation? You're learning a lot of resiliency. You're learning a lot of technical skills that you may not have had before. You're learning how to be creative and intentional about how you find enrichment if you are a really musical kid, or if all those kind of things that you can look for online. So to really try to focus on what they're positively getting out of it, instead of helping kids not get stuck in this grief process of over and negative thoughts all the time over what they're losing.
Evan, I know you've given some thought to this, and while you answer the question, I want to make sure we show your contact information. You've given some thought to this, and not everybody's in a place where you want to think about silver linings right now, but I do think that this is an opportunity for us to learn something. What do you see coming out of this that might make education better along the lines that Ms. Jones and Dr. Moody have mentioned?
Yeah, even prior to the current situation with COVID, we've recognized there is power in digital curriculum and virtual instruction to engage more students in learning. Most schools across the country still use primarily print textbooks as their main source of instruction in core content areas like English and math. But many are realizing that there's actually flexibility and cost savings in digital that could be well worth this investment in more custom tools. So, obviously COVID has forced us to ramp up the speed at which this happens to prepare for a virtual or blended environment. We've seen districts across the country, Chicago, Miami, Tampa, others, who have opted to either move to a fully digital or blend of digital and print curriculum. And what they're seeing as a benefit that's actually been accelerated now through the current situation is they're creating curriculum in this digital form where they've got an opportunity to continue to improve it and fine tune it to the unique needs of students and actually be responsive as those needs change. Whereas the print, you've got that book for 5 or 6 years. This is going to allow districts to move more flexibly between virtual and in-person instruction, which kind of all the signs are pointing to flexibility is going to be the key here. Additionally, I think there's one other nice advantage that could come out of this. Primarily in K-12, our traditional methods of awarding credit to students are all about seat time. And we do have a potential opportunity now to move to more accurate ways of measuring learning, such as competency-based models that will actually be very differentiated to the individual student. And so I think those are some real opportunities that we have right now to both learn from and accelerate, to improve education for all students.
All right, all feels very encouraging. Dr. Ellis, can you close us with an encouraging, inspiring word that convinces everyone this is all going to be okay?
I think it's going to be fine. We are learning in this new world of how to maneuver these students through education. I've always said, what a better group to have than educators to figure this one out, because we're going to put the students first. We have to always ignore the noise because we're hearing a whole bunch of it right now. But in the end, as long as we keep the students first, I love that thought of you're going to own your education now to be able to personally develop your education plan, which is something we have always talked about, personalized learning. And you're right, this is a time that we're going to come out of this better. Kids are going to have more options. And in the end, I believe parents are going to appreciate us a little bit more because we're going to think outside that box, that we're allowed to get out of the box this time. And we're going to figure it out with the kids' best interests in mind. So we're going to make it. We're going to do great things.
All right, thank you to everybody, and thanks to everyone watching and participating online. Thanks for your great questions. Sorry we couldn't get to them all. I'd like to thank all of our guests. You'll see them here: Amy Jones of the Wake PTA Council, Dr. Evan Lefsky, the Director of Education Consulting for the Public Consulting Group, PCG, Dr. Lynn Moody, Superintendent of Rowan-Salisbury Schools, and Dr. Steve Ellis of Nash-Rocky Mount Schools. Really, really appreciate your being with us. My name's Leslie Boney. Thanks for joining us for this 16-week series of webinars. Thanks to all of you for your great questions and participation. We're going to be scaling back a little bit. So our next show is going to be in 2 weeks, and we're going to go on a 2-week schedule from now forward. And in a couple of weeks, we're going to be picking up on some of those questions that people asked in the chat earlier about early childhood learning, childcare, and particularly learning loss during time of COVID. We'll have a special guest host, Pat Cronin, the Assistant Director of the Institute. So we'll go on this every 2-week schedule at 9 o'clock, next one, July 16th. Focus for the next few weeks is mostly going to be on education. We'd urge you to pass along your comments and ideas to me for future topics. Thanks today to Tony Brown for sponsoring this show in honor of Kay Yao, the North Carolina State Historically Hall of Fame women's basketball coach, and all the shows for the past month. First and Future is produced by Greg Hedgepath and James Herrick. Kirsten Chang gets the word out, keeps our chat going. Renee Potts does our slides. Simone Coleman does our research. To all of you, stay safe and see you in the future.